Well, no decision has yet been taken, but let's be clear what is at stake here. Almost 100 years ago, the whole world came together and said that the use of chemical weapons was morally indefensible and completely wrong. And what we've seen in Syria are appalling scenes of death and suffering because of the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. And I don't believe we can let that stand. Now, of course, any action we take or others take would have to be legal, would have to be proportionate, it would have to be specifically to deter and degrade the future use of chemical weapons. Let me stress to people, this is not about getting involved in a Middle Eastern war or changing our stance in Syria or going further into that conflict. It's nothing to do with that. It's about chemical weapons. Their use is wrong and the world shouldn't stand idly by. Well, the question we have to ask ourselves is, if there is no action following this big use of chemical weapons, is it going to be more likely in future that more and more regimes will use chemical weapons, that this regime will use them again and again on a larger scale and we'll see more death and more suffering? It must be right to have some rules in our world and to try to enforce those rules. Now, of course, as Prime Minister, I take my responsibilities about safeguarding our armed services incredibly carefully, incredibly seriously. But the question we need to ask is whether acting or not acting will make the use of chemical weapons more prevalent. Well, as I've said, no decision has yet been taken. Any decision would have to be proportionate, would have to be legal, would have to be about specifically deterring the use of chemical weapons. But I've recalled Parliament so this issue can be properly debated, so the government can listen to views in Parliament. And yes, it is my intention to put forward a motion in Parliament so that members of Parliament will be able to vote. Now, obviously, this is a developing situation. As I say, decisions haven't been taken, but we shouldn't stand by when we see this massive use of chemical weapons, the appalling levels of suffering, morally reprehensible, something the world came together almost 100 years ago and said these weapons shouldn't be used, and they are being used here in Syria. And that is why, in my view, we need to discuss the need to act.